The morning sun spilled through the small apartment window, illuminating the pale cream walls and the worn-out curtains that fluttered softly with the breeze. Maria Thompson sat on the edge of her bed, rubbing her swollen belly with tender hands. At 7 months pregnant, she felt every kick and movement with a mix of exhaustion and joy. Life hadn't been easy for her, working long shifts at the diner just to scrape together enough for rent, enduring whispers from neighbors who thought she was too young and too poor to be raising a child alone. But through it all, she held her head high. She believed that one day her child would be born into a world where truth and justice mattered. Maria had grown up in the small town of Willow Creek, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. She had learned quickly that in such a town, rumors traveled faster than facts, and reputations could be destroyed overnight. Still, she had never expected to become the center of a scandal, much less while carrying her first child. That morning, as she prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal, her thoughts wandered to her unborn daughter. She had already picked out a name: Grace. Grace, because that's what kept me standing when the world tried to knock me down. She smiled faintly, but her peace was shattered by a thunderous knock on the door. "Police! Open up!" a voice barked from the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Trembling, she opened the door, and before she could say a word, 2 uniformed officers pushed past her into the tiny apartment. "Maria Thompson?" one officer asked, his voice clipped and cold. "Yes, I'm Maria," she answered, clutching her belly instinctively. "What's going on?" "You're under arrest for theft and fraud. Put your hands where we can see them." Maria's eyes widened. "What? That's impossible. There must be a mistake. I've never stolen anything in my life." The officers didn't listen. One of them produced a pair of handcuffs, while the other began reciting her rights. Panic surged through her chest. "I'm pregnant," she cried out, tears filling her eyes. "Please, I didn't do anything. You can't put those on me like this." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, digging into her skin. Neighbors peered from their doors, whispering, some with pity, others with smug satisfaction. One woman muttered, "I knew she was trouble the moment she came back to this town." Maria's cheeks burned with shame as the officers marched her down the stairwell and into the waiting police car. Inside the vehicle, her mind raced. She tried to make sense of it. Theft? Fraud? She barely had money to keep food on the table, let alone run some kind of scheme. Who would do this to her? At the station, she was booked like a criminal. They took her fingerprints, her mugshot, and led her into a holding cell. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the concrete bench felt icy beneath her. She kept her hands protectively around her belly, whispering to Grace, "Mommy's here. I won't let them take us down. I promise." Hours dragged by before an officer came to escort her to an interrogation room. Detective Harris, a tall man with a sharp jawline and eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul, sat across the table. He flipped open a file and began speaking without preamble. "Maria Thompson, you've been accused of using stolen credit cards to make purchases amounting to over $15,000. The victims claim they saw you on security footage." Maria shook her head vigorously. "That's a lie. I work double shifts at a diner. I barely make enough to pay bills. Why would I risk everything, especially with a baby on the way?" Harris leaned back unimpressed. "The footage looks a lot like you, and the transactions were made in places you frequent. We also found packages delivered under your name." Maria's mouth dried. No, that's not possible. Someone must be framing me. Please, detective, you have to believe me. I've done nothing wrong." But Harris closed the file with a snap. "Tell it to the judge." That night, Maria lay in a cold cell, listening to the sound of distant sobs and the clanking of doors. Sleep refused to come. All she could think about was her baby. Would they keep her locked up until the trial? What if something happened before Grace was even born?
The next morning, she was brought before a judge for her bail hearing. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, Maria shuffled into the courtroom. The sight of the wooden benches, the stern faces, and the clicking cameras from reporters made her stomach churn. The prosecutor, a well-dressed man named Charles Grant, painted her as a cunning criminal who had used her pregnancy to gain sympathy while stealing from hard-working citizens. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "this woman poses a flight risk. The evidence against her is overwhelming. We urge the court to deny bail." Maria's public defender, a young attorney fresh out of law school, stammered as he tried to argue. "Your Honor, my client has no prior record. She's a lifelong resident of Willow Creek. She's 7 months pregnant and clearly not a flight risk. She deserves the chance to fight these charges from outside jail." The judge, a stern woman with gray hair pulled into a bun, studied Maria carefully. "Miss Thompson, do you understand the seriousness of these charges?" "Yes, Your Honor. But I swear to you, I'm innocent. Please, I have a baby coming. I need to be home." After a long pause, the judge sighed. "Bail is set at $50,000. Maria gasped. She didn't even have $500 in savings, let alone $50,000. The gavel came down, and she was led away once more. As the days turned into weeks, Maria's belly grew heavier, and so did the burden of despair. From behind bars, she wrote letters to anyone who would listen, local charities, journalists, even the governor. Most went unanswered. The few that replied offered sympathy, but no real help. Her only visitor was her childhood friend, Evelyn, who pressed her hands against the glass during visitation. "I know you didn't do this," Evelyn whispered fiercely. "Someone is setting you up. I'll do whatever it takes to prove your innocence." Maria's tears fell freely. "Please, Evie, I can't bring Grace into the world in a place like this. You have to help me." Unbeknownst to Maria, forces much darker than she imagined were working against her. The real perpetrator, someone close to her, was ensuring that the evidence stacked higher every day. Someone who knew her routines, her weaknesses, and her past. And as her due date crept closer, Maria would soon discover that the fight for her freedom was about to become a fight for her life, and the life of her unborn child.
If you're still watching, do well to hit like and subscribe button to make this story reach us in the same issue. Comment your through on the comment section. The courtroom grew colder in the days that followed Maria's arrest. Her name, once unknown, now floated in whispers across the town. The newspapers didn't spare her, labeling her a thief, a desperate woman who gambled with her unborn child's future. Yet behind those headlines was a deeper truth, one Maria carried silently, unwilling to betray the very people who had placed her in this nightmare. Maria's trial began on a gray Monday morning. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of curious spectators, all eager for the spectacle. Some came to watch a young woman fall, others to be entertained by the drama of another's life. But Maria was not a show. She was a story of survival, pain, and faith unfolding in real time. The prosecutor wasted no time painting her as reckless. "This woman," he said with theatrical precision, "chose greed over responsibility. Even in her pregnancy, she risked everything for money that was not hers. What sort of mother would endanger her own unborn child for petty cash?" The words sliced through the courtroom. Some nodded, others shook their heads. Maria sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap, her belly rising beneath her dress. She looked not like a criminal, but like someone carrying the weight of the world. Her lawyer, a public defender named James Carter, was young but determined. He saw in Maria not a case, but a human being crying out for justice. But he knew the odds. They were stacked high, and he lacked the resources of the state. But James had something the prosecutor didn't. He had Maria's story. And so he began weaving it before the jury, not as an excuse, but as a truth too powerful to ignore. He spoke of her life before the incident, of the nights she walked home from her underpaid job with aching feet and an empty stomach, of the landlord who threatened eviction unless she produced rent money in 3 days, of the medical bills that stacked higher with every doctor's visit during her pregnancy. Slowly, the courtroom shifted. Maria was no longer a faceless woman in handcuffs. She was a mother-to-be, struggling to survive in a world that had failed her long before she set foot in that store. But the prosecution wasn't done. They brought in witnesses, clerks who claimed they saw her take the items, security officers who spoke of her resistance, even neighbors who painted her as troubled. Each testimony chipped away at her defense. The jury listened. The gavel pounded. The days stretched on. And through it all, Maria endured. Behind the scenes, James dug deeper. He discovered something odd. Security footage had been cut, missing the critical 3 minutes where Maria had supposedly pocketed the goods. He pressed harder, uncovering that the store had a history of framing suspected shoplifters to make examples of them. A corporate policy designed not for justice, but for intimidation. This revelation turned the case. Suddenly, Maria's trial was no longer about one woman's alleged theft. It was about a system designed to crush the vulnerable. The press caught wind, the public grew divided, and soon the courtroom overflowed with activists, journalists, and ordinary people who saw themselves in Maria's struggle. But the pressure on Maria was unbearable. She was still pregnant, still exhausted, and still unsure if she would walk out free. Every night in her cell, she whispered prayers over her unborn child, begging God for mercy. She thought of her mother, who had raised her alone, and of the promise she had made to give her child a better life than she had known. The climax came on the final day of trial. James stood before the jury, his voice firm but heavy with conviction. He didn't beg for pity, he demanded justice. Maria Lopez is not on trial because she stole. She is on trial because she is poor. She is on trial because the system would rather break a struggling mother than admit its own cruelty. But I ask you, look at her. Is this the face of greed, or is this the face of survival? If survival is a crime, then we are all guilty. The room fell silent. Even the prosecutor seemed shaken. Maria's eyes welled with tears, but she held them back, refusing to let the world see her break. The jury deliberated for hours. Whispers filled the courtroom as the minutes dragged into the night. Maria held her breath, one hand on her belly, the other clenched tightly around the hope that justice was still possible. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Maria Lopez." The room leaned forward. Maria closed her eyes. "Not guilty." The words exploded like thunder. Gasps echoed, followed by claps, shouts, and even tears. Maria broke down, her hands covering her face as James placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. For the first time in months, she felt the weight lift. She wasn't just free, she was vindicated. But the story didn't end there. Maria's case became a symbol. Activists rallied around her, demanding reforms to stop the exploitation of poor and vulnerable people. Journalists wrote articles exposing the store's practices. Even legislators began to pay attention, using her trial as evidence that the justice system needed change. Months later, Maria gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Esperanza, Spanish for hope, because that was what she had clung to when everything else seemed lost. Maria didn't become rich, and her struggles didn't vanish overnight, but she found strength in her story. She became a voice for others who had been silenced, speaking at community centers, advocating for mothers, and proving that survival was not shameful, it was powerful. Her child grew up not in luxury, but in love, raised by a mother who had walked through fire and come out unburned. And the people who once mocked her, they remembered her tears in court, the way the truth had shattered their assumptions. They remembered that day not as a spectacle, but as a lesson that behind every headline, every accusation, every whispered rumor,
there is a human being fighting battles we may never see. Maria's story is not just hers. It is the story of countless women, countless mothers, countless people who stand accused not of crimes, but of being poor, vulnerable, and unseen. It is the reminder that justice must be more than punishment. It must be compassion, understanding, and truth. And so, her legacy lived on, not in the courtroom records or newspaper archives, but in the lives she touched, the child she raised, and the hope she carried for a better tomorrow. Because sometimes the most powerful verdict is not written by a jury, but by the courage of a single human heart.
If you're still watching, do well to hit like and subscribe button to make this story reach us in this same issue. Comment your through on the comment section.